Good morning or good afternoon since it's noon, and we're so glad that you're able to join us for lunch today at the German Marshall Fund. We want to welcome you in our third iteration of the Transatlantic Dialogue series on stakeholder influence on inclusion, diversity, and equity. I'm Reta Lewis, and I'm a senior fellow and director of Congressional Affairs at the German Marshall Fund, and have been leading this stakeholder series on DE&I. And today, I think we have a special afternoon lunchtime series here, meeting with breaking news anchor, MSNBC, NBC news journalist Richard Lui, and National Journal President Kevin Turpin. For those of you who know Richard, good morning. He has been an author of Enough About Me. It's the Unexpected Power of Selflessness. And Kevin Turpin, who is the president of the National Journal. So, Richard, over a journalism career that has really spanned over 2 decades, you've covered some of the most pivotal moments in recent history, including the Rodney King riots, the 2009 Gaza-Israel war, Hurricane Katrina, the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, I could just keep going on. Presidential elections, and recently the killing of George Floyd. So now we know in 2020, you also directed a film, Sky Blossom, which talks about the experiences of young people who serve as caregivers for military veterans. And being the author of this new book, we're so delighted to have you with us and join us this afternoon. Kevin, how can we say enough about you also? Under your leadership as a new CEO of as the new president of the National Journal, you have been transitioning from a traditional media company to an information service organization, and you've been positioning diversity and inclusion at the core of the journal's work. As a member of the Economic Club of Washington and Council on Foreign Relations, you've just been such a big leader on government relations, especially in the coalition around diversity, which aims to improve diversity on K Street. So we're just honored to have Richard and Kevin join us today on a conversation that's going to focus on race, technology, and inclusion. So I'd like to kind of start this fireside chat off by asking, the question. Let's get to the heart of one of America's most pressing challenges. And Richard, that's the problem of radicalized hate. It's become very omnipresent in the news. So what is the first step you can see about addressing what Enough About Me describes as a pandemic of selfishness and a time in which hate and violence have become cheap? So I'm going to direct that to you, and then I'm going to turn that over to Kevin.
Reta, great to sit and chat with you. And I do miss our gatherings. I do miss the German Marshall Fund and being at the Brussels Forum. And Kevin, what an honor it is to chat with you. And I know in our prep call, we got to get to know each other. And I'm really glad that we're focusing on a topic like this today in a great venue, the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It feels a little strange, and I know, Kevin, you feel this way. It's kind of strange that journalists who normally kind of like to stick to our meat and potatoes, and to kind of branch outside. It's not like we don't have thoughts. Like, we still have pulses, we still have worries and wants, and during the last year, we a lot of us around the world, right, have thought about why. And so one of the things in that pondering for a moment that we all had to do while trying to work, for those of us who were able to work, why not be a little dangerous and different in terms of what we normally do? And I guess as a journalist, typically we would write a book about maybe a topic that we cover, a space that we exist in, right, that we've done for many moons. And in this case, I don't think writing a book about being selfless fits into the typical expression of what that might be. But I think as I started to try to connect dots about what was good and not so good in what we were covering as journalists in the last decade, and hitting one of those gargantuan stories of a century or more, that, what did it mean? And I seeing all those healthcare workers out there being extremely selfless of their own health, of their own families, to help others that they did not even know, in that true sense and spirit and culture of the Hippocratic Oath on one side, and on the flip side, over the last decade, covering breaking news, seeing rashes of mass killings, seeing violence and hate being spewed at all levels of our culture and in our communities that we would never expect, and that was being done so cheaply, and all of that together, I think, came with the idea, we're living through not only pandemics of a viral nature, of a racial nature, as standing in the streets, as you just described, covering what was racial strife in our great country over 20 years. And, that's just a small bit of it, right? It made you go, what more do we need to do to fix this? All that came up with that idea that you brought up, Reta, that we are living through a selfish pandemic, and that we are overly focused on ourselves. We have perfected the ability to only think about ourselves in ways that have, and it's often aimed at social media, and it's not just social media. There's a lot of reasons why this is. Don't necessarily pick the distribution channel solely. Also explore the finger that's hitting the button.
You raised some very good points. Kevin, I want to just get your perspective on this. I mean, you're every day dealing with, loads of individuals like a Richard who are covering these stories, but yet you still come from that businessman perspective. And then you're a young Black CEO of a major news outlet. So how are you viewing this from your vantage point? And then not only about yourself, but how are you working within your institution?
Sure. Thank you, Reta, for the question. Richard, it's so good to be with you. I also want to say greetings to everyone who is present in the webinar. So where I start is just in addition to my bio, because it will give a framework on why I start here. At my heart, I'm a pastor's son from Virginia Beach, and I'm a follower of Christ. So a lot of the things that I think about, it comes from the Word of God, and then I use that in my leadership, right? So when I'm thinking about this selfishness, I 100% agree with Richard. There's a scripture that I actually use in my leadership, which it's in Philippians 2. It's do nothing out of selfish ambition and vain conceit. Instead, in humility, think of others before yourself. I wish we had more of that in our culture, more of that perspective, more of that approach. And I 100% agree with Richard that from a social media standpoint, it's easy to blame it on the platform and not take into account all of the fingers that are pressing what we press every day. And it really is out of selfishness, right? That we build bubbles around ourselves that we'll stop critical thinking. We'll agree with everything that we say, and then we just build on our opinions, and we become more ingrained because all we hear is yes, I agree, and that is the selfishness. We are naturally selfish, but also I like to think that the antidote to it is if you actually think of others, if you're intentional, if you try to get on the other side of that and intentionally think of others' perspectives, experiences before your own, it starts to change that perspective. So to your question, existing in a world where I'm leading information services company, and I'm a Black male, and I'm looking at the movement that is happening in and around us and I've grown up in, I always come back to that point that if we all would just take into account our neighbor to the right or left of us and actually get to know them, ask them questions, listen to them, that it could get the focus off of our own ambition, our own success. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be driven to achieve, we certainly should, but when that achievement and that drive always comes at the account of beating someone else down, that is where we get ourselves as a culture into the predicament we have ourselves in right now. And I believe there's hope. I believe we can break through it. But Richard's book, I think, is so important the first thing we need to address is that framework of selfishness, and again, get our minds on someone else.
Well, when you start talking about that framework of selfishness, it kind of brings me to how we kind of design these conversations we're having about stakeholders. And I think both of you said it so clearly that everybody is a stakeholder in this conversation around race and diversity and equity and inclusion. And, by no stretch of the imagination, we know to our audience, we're the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and we always look at things from a U.S. transatlantic perspective. So this is kind of a North America kind of conversation. However, both of you are global individuals. You're managing global companies. Richard, you're in a global company. You're managing global needs, and so as stakeholders, Richard, takes so for this conversation to come around these issues to come to the forefront, that people are really talking about that. So the debate around race and media's positions of race is something hard to define and understand. So I'm going to kind of turn those two questions over to the two of you, and then Kevin, let you continue into this fireside chat, because normally it's kind of a one-on-one, and we've got kind of a two-on-two here. So I'm going to step back after that kind of questioning and let the two of you go forward. But Richard, I'll start with you. Why is it taking so long?
It's not taking long at all, Rita. We can keep on chatting. Like this is a three-way fireside. We like it. I don't like that guy Kevin though. He's a pastor's kid. I am too. My
oh my God.
Yeah, you got two PKs in the building here, so look out.
Here we go. We'll try not to make it a sermon.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, full disclosure, being a visiting fellow for the German Marshall Fund has been one of the great honors and pleasures to try to explore a space that I think is so important. Spaces that are related to exactly what the topic is of the day, which is how do we think outside of what we are? And when we think back to the very beginning of the German Marshall Plan, what it meant to think of other countries that are different than our own, and the transatlantic dynamic in the theater itself, over 100 countries are what we talk about when we think of the transatlantic relationship opportunity that's in front of us. These are all really important dynamics that fit in with the topic itself. And so when I think of why this conversation fits in so well, it fits in so well, of all the Brussels forums that I've been to, that's always been the focus, is where can we understand how we're different so we can find the sameness? Where are the actual details that we're not working so well? And as we live through this recent period of nationalism and of separatism and of we just don't like you isms, it has been so important that the conversations that the German Marshall Fund has done in many ways, not only through the Brussels Forum, but throughout its year-long programming. And as you visit through the different bureaus across the country, that's exactly the purpose. When I was talking about journalism with the State Department in Poland, I stopped by the German Marshall. I met with some German Marshall Fund members of the team there. Same in Berlin and in Brussels. And so this kind of active on the ground, how do we bring people together ideologically so we can run a better world, is exactly in line with, I think, Kevin and I in our discussion today about why this sort of idea is important. As we think of polities and where they might go and where they have come from, in the short amount of time I've been around, as I think back to the 80s and 90s and the Cold War and thereafter, and the very idea of what the German Marshall Fund stands for, to get us through that very period in a safe way. I mean, to really simplify it. It's the very spirit that I think is why when we think of thinking outside of ourselves up to a point is important. The idea behind self-protection, and at least in the selflessness space, which is unmitigated selflessness, countries and nations also need to think about when do we reach the limit of what we can give? Where is that limit, and how do we strive to find out where that rough edge is, that fine line or that very fat line? And then so when you ask that question, Rita, that's the thing I think about that topic.
Mhm.
You
Kevin?
know, I think that that's so interesting, and it's interesting in the point that when you think about selflessness and finding that line and exploring it, it often starts in actually being willing to explore it, right? A lot of the friction points that we have in our culture today is staying where you are and being rigid. So it's more important to be right than to be vulnerable and say, I don't know. So what we have is people on all sides saying that my perspective is the right one, and my job is to pull people over to my perspective. And if they don't come over to my perspective, it is to say that they are wrong, that they are on the wrong side. In some frameworks, people are on the wrong side, right? But we're all accomplished people. We don't like being told that we're on the wrong side, even if we know. So what happens is we have environments where people don't listen, and instead we talk across each other. So we can't even get to the point where we're exploring the line, right? So we don't even start the process of exploring the line. When I was thinking about this today, in the conversation today, I was thinking about the term forgiveness, right? So there is a need to forgive, but forgiveness actually is first an acceptance of truth, right? That there has to be some truth that needs to be forgiven. And there's often disagreement in the culture on what the truth is. And there is a truth. Like I'm a big believer that there is a truth, and there's a fact-based, these are experiences that are just natural truths. And we can't even agree on what those truths are. And I believe that actually having people come just to explore what the truth is and to accept it as we see it would be a start of then exploring what selflessness looks like. Question for you, Richard, just as I heard you speaking, you've been in the middle of all of these different huge moments and often disruptive moments, certainly in our country's history, but in the world's history. Have you seen a thread of when things start turning in a positive direction, where you see even a baby step forward? What are the central elements that you see in those people that lead that baby step forward?
Yeah, you know this so well, you know, as we speak as professional colleagues in this industry, is that we want to get the story out, and I think a lot of folks may be watching or listening or reading about these stories of strife in many different ways. Is that's the only story, and often when as I've been covering these killers or murderers, or in these places where we've had great racial strife. We might focus on, and I remember this case when I was in Ferguson, and you know, I just visited where Michael Brown's body had laid there for hours and was talking with his grandfather and his family, and that might be the focus of the entire story for days or maybe even weeks, and you know this, but you see all the other incidents around them of amazing humanity. And the question is, when does that fit into the story arc? I don't want you to walk away thinking we aren't going to try to make this better, that we aren't capable of getting better. And in all of these stories, I find amazing people that say we are going to be better, and we are better than this. I write about it in the book because I'm a half glass full kind of person. And, you know, there was Muhammad, who owned Sam's Meat Market on Florissant there, staying in the Ferguson context, who stayed open, even though his meat market was the one that was being looted and burnt every night.
Wow.
And what he did is he opened the next day. And it wasn't, you know, the first day that I went to go speak with him. I waited 3 or 4 days. And I said, we got to interview these folks. Why is Muhammad opening up? And so I went in there, and he said, well, I'm here for those who need me. I only have because it was looted. I only have 6 cans of this on this. The shelves were sparse, but he had little things here and there. He said, but what I got to be there for them because I'm their community. This is why I'm here. He also happened to have mentioned, I'm Muslim. This is what we do. This is part of my religion. It is for the other. It is to care for others. And I said, what does your wife tell you? And he says, don't go to work. And then why do you come? Well, exactly what I told you, Richard. And those are the stories around all of these. When I was at Bataclan, same situation. And I don't want to, take up all the airwaves here, but that's the hope. And it's been there every single time. And it's our job as journalists to see how we can remember to keep that. Look, the National Journal does a great job of that. And you're able to do that. In cable news, we maybe don't have the same sort of capability all the time, but I think that's our obligation. And I wonder when you're going through this, Kevin, how do you keep that in the arc for your teams that are out there covering all these stories?
It's such a great point of conversation. And there's something that you picked up on that is central, at least to my leadership. So I'll tell the frame of the story. We actually are doing very good work within National Journal, just seeking to become as inclusive as possible. So when you say exploring, what's that line? I don't know where the line stops, but I know the start of it is just starting to walk towards it, right? And how do you become inclusive? How do you become diverse? How do you become equitable? And not to assume that you already are at the beginning. Actually really seek to listen, learn, understand, not only from an ethnic perspective, but from different sexual orientations, different experiences that people may bring into your organization. So I not only lead a business, I'm a leader of humans, right? So I have a group of 125 humans that have individual experiences. And sure, I have a responsibility to make sure that National Journal is a growing and thriving company financially, but I have just as big a responsibility to make sure that the humans that work for me feel seen, feel heard, feel like they're growing, feel like they can bring themselves into the organization. So in that framework, we had a great training. It was a gentleman, his name is Dushal Hackett. And Dushal came in and he taught us about this concept called individuating. And his point raised, as I said, I could take up the whole time on what I learned from these sessions, but the he raised was that when we're thinking about unconscious bias, that we all have it, every single one of us, Black, white, any color, any ethnicity. It's a natural brain function to help us think efficiently. Our brain processes like millions of things, and we create biases to help us actually be able to move forward and make decisions. But the way to counteract the natural brain function is to individuate, which essentially is to humanize every person you come in contact with. Because our brain will dehumanize people so we can make decisions faster. So you can see how that can go into a dangerous place. If we naturally dehumanize so we can get to a better decision for ourselves, we started with selfishness. So from the individuating standpoint, it's as simple as asking questions about, where are you from? I'm from California. Well, tell me about your hometown. How did you grow up? Tell me about your parents. All of a sudden, you know something about that person. They're human, right? And once they become a human, now you're making decisions in relation to that person. They're no longer just a bullet point in your day from a decision-making standpoint. They now are a human that has a story that you may have gotten to know some struggles or some problems that they've had, their dreams, their ambitions, and you're gonna really take into account who they are. So that will jump ahead of all of the processing our brain's gonna naturally do. So the reason why I tell that story is that now I try to run the organization that way. So if our journalists are out and they're doing a story, have you gotten to know your sources? Do you understand who they are? Do you understand the perspective that the story that they're coming from? Do you have all the perspectives that you need? Or are we going to the same well of sources every time? On our information services side, when we're creating an analytical document, what about the people that this impacts? What do we know about that? I understand the numbers say X, and I understand that traditional orthodoxy says that we should analyze this in a certain way. Well, let's take a critical look at that and seek to understand what is the impact of what you're writing on humans. And that is how I'm at least trying to move the organization to make sure that we are telling stories, we're producing research, we're producing consulting that is truly taking into account different perspectives, because it's going to get us to a better answer. It's going to get us to a point where we're truly moving into a direction that is taking into account all of the different stakeholders that might come to a particular policy area or particular decision that needs to be made in Washington, et cetera. So I love the story you just told, because you get to know what motivates people.
Yeah, you know, when you were talking about that, Kevin, about individuation and that ability to get past what might be already built in our unconscious and conscious biases that we've got. One of the things that when I was doing research for the book that really stood out to me, because, you know, I think about the ability, so as you understand so well, we're always trying to understand the regionality of our country and how to express that in a rich way in the fabric. And just like you express the individuality of different continents and different countries, and to really find that nice stuff that we all can really enjoy, and how we're different, again, as I was saying earlier. And one of the things that when you do a Stanford study that looked at people who didn't like each other because of their race. And what they did is they gathered hundreds of pairings, and they had each pairing do both qualitative and quantitative tests. Qualitative meaning a questionnaire, meaning they actually took blood tests and measured cortisol and dopamine and all those things. And they picked those pairings that had the highest amount of prejudice against each other. And then they had them meet 3 times, 3 lunches, 3 coffees, 3 gatherings, whatever the case may be. And by the 3rd meeting, those measurements, both qualitative and quantitative, went all the way down to just above 0. And when I was digging into that, I was like, boy, you know, I wish I had a study, not a broad program when I was in high school, but a study of, if I'm from this region, I happen to be from California, then send me to Savannah, or send me to Iowa, anywhere in the state of Iowa. Get me there for that 6 months, and I bet you that, or go abroad, but, you know, I think we can probably do better domestically for a moment here in the United States, but go abroad, where the case may be, that those 3 meetings, what's in the book, three lunches, we can be in a better place. And that's when I think of like organizational leadership in a place that you sit in, both of you, is then the question is, if it's for a for-profit business, did your team meet with the potential partner 3 times? Did they have 3 lunches? Don't tell me that's a dead lead, because you need to go 3 times for that. Then you can say, all right, that's a dead lead. I don't know.
No. Another thing that I'm giving Dushal a commercial here, but another thing he taught us is about habitual practice. And I don't think Dushal's alone. It's something in their community. And when I say the community, the trainers of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, these are all terms and things that they teach. And habitual practice is so important. He says nothing happens without habitual practice. It's more important that you choose one thing you're going to do and you do it habitually, then you have a program of 10 actions you're going to make to seek to become more inclusive. He would prefer you choose one and do it every time, because that's the only way we change pattern. It's just like a basketball player. I played basketball when I was in high school, and my jump shot got better when I decided to shoot 400 jump shots a day, every day. Then, lo and behold, I was able to make more jump shots in the game, right? So that's how life and this
I got worse and worse. I got worse and worse. Seriously, it went the other way for me.
So sometimes habitual practice helps you learn things that are just not your calling. So
yeah, there you go. See,
you know what? That brings yeah. No, what'd you say, Richard?
I was gonna say, Rita, that is so true. What Kevin just said. Sometimes we don't give it enough try to figure it out. It ain't our cup of tea. And, because my mom is musical, my brother's musical, I thought, oh, maybe I'm musical. Maybe. So I took piano lessons. Horrible. My dad likes basketball. I went YBA. I'm horrible. And that's okay, because you need to do the 400 to figure out you can't do it. And I think when we don't try to figure it out, like the selflessness, that's a bit much, isn't it? Do I give money to a person who's living in the street? Well, the reason why I feel uncomfortable is I don't have the practice. And to build on the concept, the one I wanted to hammer really, really quickly on selflessness is the reason why those healthcare workers were able to go to work during a period of a pandemic where we had no answers. We didn't have the PPE. We didn't understand how that we got it for a while or how it spread necessarily. We didn't have a solution for it. They still went to work. And the reason being is because they were practiced, selfless people. They had the muscle tone to leap when we needed them to leap. In that clutch play when Kevin was in, you go to him, he was ready because he had the muscle tone. And the very same idea of that 3 lunches and many other things that we make a conscious decision about every 15 minutes. If we can start to build the muscle tone so that when the bigger things are in front of us about thinking outside of ourselves, it's much more easy for us to do.
Yes.
I'm going to go. It could be as simple as going to lunch.
Yes.
Rita, let's go.
Well,
what can I get you, Kevin?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Both of you have talked about values and in the chat room, and we definitely encourage any of our listeners to put some questions in there. But one of them, Kevin, before I go back to you, is that they talk about they wanted to know how do we transition some of these foundational values of our society to reward expanding one's own point of view instead of just staunchly standing by, what we know, I guess. Yeah. Even though we're in a time of evolution on all of these big issues and challenges that have a intersection between race, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's a great question because our incentive systems are actually built around selfishness, right? We're incented for being selfish, and that's a world system. That's not even necessarily just in North America or America. And, I think it takes a conscious effort to be a learner, right? So we need to start to understand where our mind needs to expand to by just starting with understanding, right? It's so hard to, and let me hammer that point down. Many people understand to counterpoint. So I come across this all the time. I've read all the books. I've read about, I did the learning, and then right after they're there with the counterpoint, which is the same point that's been made, right? Everyone understands the point that's being made, whether it be in America that our system was created to reward the person who works the hardest, right? That's something we tell ourselves, but we don't look at that critically and say, is that the case? Start there. Is that the case? That the person who works the hardest always gets rewarded. The point that's made, and maybe that's a truth, but we don't explore that truth. So my point being that you can't expand your horizons if you're not willing to let the shade up a little bit.
Richard, what's your perspective on that question?
Yeah, we take a look at cultural self-righteousness and the structural problem that might be in front of us. It is, I think, you know, that we've always heard this, and again, as we frame this as a North American context potentially, and what might be extrapolated transatlantically, is, you know, I've certainly felt the often correct idea that maybe when me as an American might go abroad, that I might think I'm going to be more right, especially, and the expression goes that it's been out there for 100 years, I just speak louder, and so therefore I am going to be more right. And I think that when it comes to self-righteousness and the idea that, you know, we are struggling with you're wrong, I'm right, is to be a good listener. And I think what will help us understand what is the right for me to be right is that if I can listen to what others are saying, so that I can actually see if what I believe is contextually correct. And a way to challenge that to listen is not only to listen to people talking to you, but also to go out to listen. And the way you can go out to listen is to read the things that are not in your opinion, that do not solidify what you believe, but that which may challenge it. And I think that's the way we can really understand how right we are if we think we are. And, you know, as I going through in North America, the anti-Asian hate phenomenon over the last year and a half, have often been asked, well, what can I do, Richard? And the thing is, you can do that to your fellow Asian friend. But, you know, just because I'm this does not mean I'm Mr. Expert on it, because I'm probably not expert at this, because I've had a lot of problems with being Asian, so I'm no expert on it. But another way to be an active listener to identify how right you really are, if you will, is to go read about this community. Go read about what is it that Asian Americans are talking about. Go to a Neck Shark, go to NBC Asian America, read those things. And that's the way we can truly identify if we're hungry to understand our self-righteousness, if we're hungry to figure out how to get past it, is to actively listen. And it's more than just asking questions and listening. It is also going out to read the great stuff that's out there.
I love that, Richard, and this being willing to actually read what's already available, right? So after George Floyd happened, I am an African-American president of a majority white organization. And I had a number of colleagues who wanted to learn more. And they came to me. And I actually took a tack of, I'm in a leadership position, and right. I feel it is my responsibility to engage them. However, eventually, a lot of my engagement was, read this. I can only tell you Kevin Turpin's experience. And I'm happy to tell you Kevin Turpin's experience, but my experience is not monolithic with the African-American experience in America. So there are scholars that have studied this who can bring historical points that you probably didn't see in school. In fact, you didn't see them in your school books, in your college study, or in your PhD study. You should explore it, and then let's have a conversation. I've taken now to responding to questions about the African-American experience with questions. So if someone is to ask me, what do you think we should do about this plight of African Americans? And then there's all the qualifiers around it. And I don't believe in CRT, and I don't believe, which is totally fine. I think those are people's right. Although I will say, most people who say that have never read what CRT is. What they've seen is what they've seen on social media. And this is not me endorsing CRT, it's me saying there's a lot of lack of knowledge about what it is. So before being against something, learn about it. And it may confirm what you think and the potential problems, but let's seek to learn and understand and start from there. Let's develop some knowledge of an experience. And I can't give you the full experience. I can give you, again, I can give you Kevin Turpin's experience, and but my experience is different than every other African-American who lives in the country or Black person who lives in the world. So I love that point on, and I have my own learning to do, right? So I have Asian American colleagues who told me the same thing, right? I'm reaching out, I'm wanting to be an ally, and they pointed me to reading I can do, so I can seek to understand and understand how their experience is different, and what shaped their experience, what shaped their perspectives, what are the different perspectives out there. It's really important that if we can get to that point, my belief is it's part of the humanizing process, right? So we just talked about individuating and humanizing. It's part of humanizing, it's part of respect for someone if you seek to understand and you don't put onus on them to help you understand, that you do some work yourself.
You know, you raise such fascinating questions, in the sense that when you say your own perspective, you know, people may see me as an African-American female, but what they don't see the backdrop is that I'm an African-American female from the South. So I'm a daughter of the South. I was raised doing challenging times and challenging periods, and have seen evolution. So to hear both of you talk about your individual experiences, I think is so important, because, you know, Richard, you said it so perfectly. Go study up, go learn, go. I mean, we're not the expert, and not trying to be the expert. But the thing is that from a commonality perspective, we have some shared experiences. So therefore we have some shared values. But now as we want to move, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to keep to be about these conversations? And, you know, we had another question in the chat before you give your response to what Richard was saying. They're saying, how do we sustain the movement towards greater equity? You know, the polls are now showing slight decline in support for racial justice. People are arguing it's fatigue. They're fatigued with the topic. You know, I can talk about being fatigued with the topic, because we can never be fatigued with the topic because of who we are. So what's your thought on that, on all of that, especially with how Kevin was also interpreting?
Yeah, you know, I think the idea about trying to grow in the space, and I love those allies that understand it's going to take work. It's not I'm going to show up. It's going to be I'm going to show up, and then I'm going to show up, and then I'm going to show up, and then I'm going to show up. And I know that's it's a bit much, but please keep on trying. It's so appreciated from all of these communities that have suffered across the world. You know, showing up counts so much, and the way we show up, while there's the one extreme of self-righteousness, I think the dominating idea is there's lots of different ways you can show up, and it's not, and it can be what's good for you. And we've discussed a couple of ideas so far that Kevin brought up and I discussed as well. Showing up's important. There's a self-righteous notion out there, but know that that is the smaller part of it. The bigger part is find out what's the good way that we can learn together. And one of the terms that I was kind of thinking of, Reta, to your question is, and what Kevin was saying is, I think whether we're on the learning side or in the side now where we need to own our voice, like I didn't necessarily become a journalist to talk and report on what it means to be Asian American or Asian in America, but there's no turning back. When you turn on the TV, this is what you got. I mean, this is the face, and I didn't know that was going to be the way that I would begin my broadcast journalism career necessarily. So I'm not going to walk away from it. And I think as this past 5 years about understanding what race means, you know, as a man of color, as a person of color, reporting on other communities of color, has really opened my eyes and about how I need to kind of learn and keep on learning. And so I try to be emphatically vulnerable in the way that I discuss these particular situations. And I mean emphatic because I must go at it. I must figure out directly and specifically what is the problem, what might be the solutions, and what are the dynamics of this context emphatically. But I must not go at it like I am the expert, but that I'm going to share something with you, and that we can walk down together vulnerably. And that's very positive. But I'm not going to be one or the other. They're going to be both together. And I think that is a way that we can approach this journey of greater equity. And when we can be open-hearted but hardworking at the same time. And that's, I think, the balance that we're trying to figure out in today's world, because we've set it up as one gear, a one or a zero. What was earlier brought up very pointedly and very cogently, of being self-righteous or not being self-righteous. And I think maybe we change the goalposts and we approach it culturally in a different way.
Yeah.
One of your themes you addressed in Enough About Me, and it kind of keeps coming up as you're talking about your experiences, is about the whole, in Enough About Me, you talk about that model minority myth. And so from your perspective, what is the model minority myth, and why is it so problematic in this narrative of that's out here now around DE&I?
Yeah, model minority. We need to know what it is if you don't, and then never use it again, or try not to use it in practice. It just drives me nuts. So model means good. And if there's a good minority, then there's a bad minority. This is the emphatic part of me. And that is there is no such thing as a good or a bad minority. This has been set up since the founding of our nation. It has only became culturally, I think, in vogue, if you will, in terms of the term itself since the 1960s. And the very idea that there would be, in this case, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders being the model minority in that today's context was different. It was the Italians that were put in this good, bad minority place before, and the Irish that were put in the good, bad, and now it sets up our racial structure, if there were to be one, in that very space. In other places around the world, that might not be the word, but it might be what has been practiced. And there is no good minority because, for instance, if there were to be one, doesn't the good minority generally not get treated as subhuman, as being beaten and killed and face hate crimes? I mean, that's what you might see in the last year and a half of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Do you get to the highest levels in organizations as leadership? Do you get the commensurate compensation packages? Well, they don't. And so the whole idea, but it's just, let's take a step back from that in the very structure of model minority. It's just wrong when you have a good, bad minority structure. Because they're okay, right? That's where it's been put. It's like, oh, they're okay. They don't need any help. They're just fine. But what we can't do is always be comparing one group against another, because one does not only equal two. 1 + 1 when we have a racial fabric like we do in many countries around the world, is a 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. Diversity always equals extreme multiplication, right? That you when you're in truly diverse and inclusive environments, not only is it the right thing to do, it's actually good business, it's good policy, and you end up getting to a point where you create policy, you create business ideas that are so much better than when you have monolithic environments, because you're taking in different perspectives that then pull in. Diversity begets diversity, right? So when you commit internally, all of a sudden you're pulling in people into whatever you're doing, whether you're a think tank or you're a for-profit business, you're a nonprofit, you're a foundation, you're pulling in more people, right? You're not cordoning off. I think what happens now in our culture is we choose target groups, And then we go down the rabbit hole of making everything comfortable to that target group. And that can be successful to a period, but eventually your market size runs out. So I'm talking from a business perspective, and you got to figure out, well, what am I going to do next? So I think that ultimately is a great point, that 1 + 1 = 3, right? And 2 + 2 = 8. It actually is a multiplying effect when you commit yourself. It's hard, right? Because what happens when you get into a diverse and inclusive environment is you have to constantly work and fight to kill fear, right? So fear can be a positive emotion or a negative emotion. It depends on how you react to it. So I recently did a sermon, and being a pastor's son, I've always been in business. I always want to be in business, and I have no intention to follow in my dad's career. But I was asked to give the Father's Day sermon at his church. I was scared. I was so scared. So
you better be. Oh, yeah.
And that was, but that fear drove me to prepare for 40+ hours for my sermon and to study, et cetera. And then lo and behold, when I got to the day of, I wasn't scared anymore. So that's where if fear motivates working harder, pushing through, seeking to really understand fully what you're going to be doing, that's positive. What I see in organizations, this leading organization, is it also can produce retraction. So I like telling this story of when my son, who's 5 years old, is running into a dark room. As soon as he gets to the edge of the dark room, he turns around and runs back to me, because I'm in a comfortable place, right? We're at that point of fear, when you're going to push through, I'm going to keep going, or I'm going to run back to the comfortable place. And in DEI, what's really important is you're going to reach that fear point, because you're going to reach a point where you start questioning ways that you've thought. You might even start questioning ways that your parents have taught you to think. You start getting scared about what that means. And a lot of times what that produces is people running back to their comfortable place. So Reta, you brought up that research is showing that support for racial justice is going down, because we're reaching that uncomfortable point, right? When George Floyd first happened, it was, wow, I can't believe this has been happening for centuries in our country. We have to do something. But then we started unpeeling. Wait, I thought this was this police reform. You mean there's economic effects here? And you start unpeeling the breadth of it, and you get nervous and you get scared, and people run back to the comfortable places. So to the question on where we start, I link it back to that question on, well, how do we keep progress? When you reach fear, allow it to motivate you to keep going instead of running back to the comfortable place.
Yeah, I got to say that because I was talking, Kevin, about that very issue of discomfort. And it was with other APIs and media. And I realized at that moment, discomfort and uncomfort, as painful as it has been, is what is good. And that as we push towards that better place, that the discomfort is a positive thing. Organizational leaders, if you feel uncomfortable about your racial policy, about how you're going to be more inclusive, about finding better faces for your board, about those who are in the corner offices, that it is one or the other, that it shouldn't be one or the other, and that it is, as we've been talking about, very much exponential in the outcomes, but it's going to be uncomfortable potentially, because culturally, that's not where we've been. It is not where we've been, but that's where the real rubber hits the road, are those decisions that will be made for your boardrooms, for your corner offices, for where you will be putting in your budget, for the big things, like for the Asian American community. Where are the historical sites in your state? Where are the historical sites in your country that show the contributions that were made by that community and many others? Because folks will be watching, and help those communities get the big things done. It's more expensive, takes more time, maybe some research, but we need the help, and it'll be worth it. the March on the Mall in the United States for Asian America, for unity, for all the groups that have gone through this. That's an important historical potential event, because in the last 10 years, as an example of how organizations can really double down, for the most part, in the last year and a half, of just amazing things. All three of us have seen it across the world, the way they've stepped up to really understand and put their resources where their ideas are. And there were about 200,000 babies in America born during the last year. In that same year, where there were 6,600 incidents self-reported of hate against Asian Americans. Just a large number for this small community. But those 200,000 babies that happen to look like me, when they turn 10 in 1 decade, I so hope that they open their history books and they read how horrible this year has been, but they see how amazing we were in our response to say this is wrong and that we need to do things better. And the same is true for the same millions of babies that were born in communities of color that also have faced similar dynamics, that in 10 years, like your son, Kevin, when he's in high school in 15, he better open that history book, and it better say that we did the right thing, because otherwise it only sets another precedent that it's okay that we didn't do anything.
Yeah. Amen.
Yes, I'm telling you, we've got some amens going up in here today. But as we come to our close, I just want to throw out a final question. Kevin, I'll start with you. It's like, why should, I'll start like we began. Why should every person be a stakeholder in this diversity, equity, and inclusion? And it's such a timely conversation, and it's one that is timeless. And our listener in the chat room said they want to know, how have you seen the intersection of humility and power being effective inclusion in the volatile situations in your work? Because you as a CEO, and then I'll go to Richard as an award-winning journalist for wrap up.
So I'll answer that question first, and I'll do it concisely because I know we're at the end. Humility and power, what is at the center of it is grace. So you have to exist in grace and truth. You can't just be all grace. That you have to recognize truth, seek to understand it, seek to move forward from it. But that's how you exist between humility and power. You always remember grace. You meet people where they are. But you also don't accept untruth and let that go forward, that you constantly pursue truth and try to implement that and let it change you, let it move you. To your broader question, I actually think if I was going to give one word that would envelop this whole conversation, it's be kind. That's 2. Be devoted to good. If we all could just get there, we all understand that. I understand intersectionality, and I think it is a real thing. The thing that can go in between all those intersections is to devote yourself to doing good to others. So I'll stop.
Richard, we'll let you have the last word.
Thank you, Reta. Appreciate you for doing this and gathering us, and more conversations like this. So important, Kevin, as well. And we'll have to work together. We'll go on the road and
I love it.
do more of this. We'll call it the 2 PKs.
There you go.
That's what we'll do. But the word of intersection from Kelly that was brought up is, how do we figure out systems to see the different parts of who we all are? And look, we all love the Zoom, and but conference calls are good, emails are good too. And in those different spaces, we are able to see different parts of who we are. I'm talking about organizational communication. But what are the systems to everyday business that brings out the beautiful different parts of every single one of the team members that gather every day to achieve some sort of mission? And I think that, some days I show up and I'm male. Sometimes I show up and I'm the Asian American Pacific Islander. Some days I show up and I'm the Californian. Some days I show up and I'm the journalist. Some days I show up and I'm the community volunteer. And some days I bring 2 of those things in the door. Sometimes I bring 3, to my opinion. And I think the more that we can figure out how to open, to get put on those lenses that allow us to see those different things. You brought up yourself, Reta. You're not only a woman, you're not only African American and African woman, you're also a person from the South on top of that, and you can go on and on, right? You like red glasses, whatever the case may be. I know there's a story, by the way. I know there's a story behind the glasses. There's a story, but that is the idea of what we're all learning to see, including myself, are the different intersections of the human being, and that they're all different and they all arrive at different times and different places. And even though you've met the same person for many moons or many moments, that is the opportunity we have in front of us.
Well, I'm gonna tell you, with that opportunity, I just want to say thank you to both Kevin Turpin and to Richard Lui today. We could not have had a more dynamic conversation around the issues. I told people they were going to be in for a treat in a different kind of conversation, but these are the global topics and the global conversations that are taking place all across the world, not just in the US and in the transatlantic space. And so we want to say to our audience, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned. And, as Richard says, enough about me. It's enough about all of us. It needs to be about all of us. And all of us means that's why we have a stake. And that's why we are stakeholders in the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so today we have heard from 2 great influencers who have just spoken the truth. So Richard, I'm gonna leave it with this. We got to do the 2 PK, but you also got to do the two PK. People, for those who don't know, it's called Preacher's Kid, but I'm also the granddaughter.
Oh, okay.
So here we go. There we go.
PK, right? But we just want to say, on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, we just really appreciate you joining this side conversation. And thank you to Kevin and Richard again. And thank you for our audience for joining in with us. See you soon.